The afternoon sun streamed through the airport windows as Dorothy Williams clutched her boarding pass in one hand and her worn leather purse in the other. At 78 years old, she moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that rushing only led to falls, and falls at her age meant hospital visits she couldn't afford. Gate B17, she whispered to herself, squinting at the electronic board overhead. Her arthritis was acting up today, making each step down. The long terminal a small exercise in determination, but Dorothy had been determined her whole life. As a schoolteacher for 43 years in the same South Carolina district, as a widow raising her son alone after her husband passed, and now as a great-grandmother traveling across the country to meet the newest addition to their family. The gate area buzzed with the usual pre-boarding energy, business people tapping urgently on laptops, parents trying to contain restless children, and travelers of all sorts staring zombie-like at their phones. Dorothy found a seat near the boarding gate and eased herself down with a soft sigh of relief. 6 hours, she thought, looking at her ticket for the non-stop flight to San Francisco. Lord, give me strength. She reached into her purse for her pill container, carefully selecting the medication she needed to take before the flight. Her doctor had been clear. Stay hydrated, especially with these pills. She made a mental note to ask for water as soon as she boarded. When the gate agent announced pre-boarding for those needing extra assistance, Dorothy gathered her things. Though fiercely independent, she had learned to accept help when offered, especially with the long walks through airports that seemed designed for younger legs than hers. "Ticket, please," the young gate agent said with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Dorothy handed over her boarding pass, receiving a cursory nod before being waved through. The jet bridge seemed endless, but Dorothy maintained her steady pace, one hand on the railing. By the time she reached the aircraft door, a line had formed behind her. "Welcome aboard," a flight attendant greeted, his gaze already shifting to the passengers behind her. Dorothy thanked him anyway and made her way down the narrow aisle to seat 23D, an aisle seat she had specifically requested for easier bathroom access. Settling into her seat took effort. Her joints protested as she lowered herself down, arranging her purse beneath the seat in front of her. The cabin gradually filled with more passengers. A young couple with matching headphones took the window and middle seat beside her, nodding politely before immediately returning to their shared movie. Dorothy watched as flight attendants moved through first class with trays of orange juice and water. One flight attendant, a woman with honey blonde hair pulled into a tight bun, seemed especially attentive to the passengers up front, laughing at their jokes and remembering their names. "I'll just ask when she comes this way," Dorothy thought, her throat already feeling dry from her medication. The economy cabin continued filling. Across the aisle, a businessman in a crisp suit settled in, immediately receiving a cheerful greeting from the same blonde flight attendant. "Good afternoon, sir. Can I get you something to drink before takeoff?" "Sparkling water, no ice," he responded, without looking up from his phone. Dorothy straightened in her seat, expecting to be offered the same courtesy. The flight attendant, her name tag read Heather, reached across to hand the businessman his drink, her arm practically brushing Dorothy's shoulder. Yet somehow, Heather's gaze never acknowledged Dorothy's presence. The attendant continued down the aisle, offering pre-flight beverages to other passengers. Dorothy's brow furrowed slightly, but she quickly smoothed her expression. She had lived long enough to recognize when she was being overlooked. It was a familiar feeling, one that had shadowed her through decades of subtle and not-so-subtle slights. But Dorothy had also lived long enough to know when to speak up and when to wait. There would be drink service after takeoff. She could wait. The safety demonstration began as Dorothy discreetly moistened her lips. The pills were beginning to make her mouth uncomfortably dry, but years of classroom management had taught her patience. As the plane pushed back from the gate, Dorothy closed her eyes briefly and said a silent prayer, partly for safe travels and partly for the strength to endure the journey ahead. The takeoff was smooth, the powerful engines lifting the massive aircraft into the air with surprising grace. Dorothy watched through the window across the aisle as the city below grew smaller, buildings turning into miniature models, then mere specks, before disappearing altogether beneath a layer of clouds. 20. Minutes into the flight, the seatbelt sign dinged off. Almost immediately, the first-class cabin sprang to life with activity, flight attendants offering hot towels, taking drink orders, providing warm nuts and porcelain dishes. Dorothy watched as Heather moved with efficiency and warmth through the premium cabin, chatting easily with passengers as though they were old friends at a dinner party she was hosting. Water service should start soon, Dorothy thought, trying to ignore her increasingly dry throat. She noticed other flight attendants, beginning to prepare the beverage carts at the front of the economy section. Another 15 minutes passed. The young couple beside her had fallen asleep, heads tilted together like nesting birds. Across the aisle, the businessman was now typing furiously on his laptop, a half-empty water glass on his tray table. Dorothy noticed that his glass had been refilled without her even seeing the flight attendant come by. When the beverage cart finally appeared at the front of her section, Dorothy felt relief wash over her. She watched as it made its way slowly down the aisle, stopping at each row. The flight attendant pushing the cart was not Heather but a younger man with a friendly smile who seemed to be in training, based on how he checked with his colleague, before pouring each drink. Finally, the cart reached her row. The male attendant looked at the sleeping couple beside her. "Would they like anything to drink?" he asked Dorothy in a hushed tone. "I don't believe so. They're sound asleep," Dorothy responded with a warm smile. "But I would very much appreciate some water, please." Just as the attendant reached for a cup, Heather appeared beside him, placing a hand on his arm. "I'll handle this section, Raj. Why don't you take your break now?" The young man looked slightly confused, but nodded. "Of course." He smiled apologetically at Dorothy before heading toward the back of the plane. Dorothy's smile remained in place as Heather took control of the cart. "May I please have some water?" she asked again, her voice clear but gentle. Heather seemed busy rearranging items on the cart. "We'll be coming through with another service later," she said without looking up, then pushed the cart forward to the next row. Dorothy sat there, her empty tray table suddenly feeling like a small but significant rejection. She watched in disbelief as Heather cheerfully served the rows behind her. Had she somehow become invisible? An hour into the flight, Dorothy's mouth felt like cotton. The medication was working. She could feel the reduced pain in her joints, but the side effects were becoming uncomfortable. She noticed the call button above her seat and, after a moment's hesitation, pressed it. The small light illuminated and Dorothy waited. 5 minutes passed, then 10. She could see other call buttons being answered promptly further up the cabin. After nearly 20 minutes, Heather appeared, her expression making it clear that the interruption was unwelcome. "Yes?" she asked, her tone suggesting Dorothy was taking up valuable time. "I'm sorry to bother you," Dorothy said, her dignity intact despite her discomfort. "But I need some water. I've taken medication, and I need to stay hydrated." Heather's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We'll be coming through with water service shortly, if you could just be patient." Without waiting for a response, she reached up and turned off the call button, then walked away. Dorothy watched her go, a lifetime of similar experiences washing over her. She thought of her classroom from decades ago, how she had taught generations of children to treat others with kindness and respect, regardless of their age or color. She thought of her own mother, who had worked as a housekeeper for wealthy white families, coming home with stories both of casual cruelty and unexpected kindness. Across the aisle, a young mother with a sleeping toddler had been watching the interaction. She caught Dorothy's eye and frowned slightly in concern. "Are you okay?" she mouthed. Dorothy nodded politely, not wanting to make a fuss. The young mother reached into her diaper bag and pulled out an unopened bottle of water, stretching across the aisle to offer it. "Please take it," she whispered. "I have more." Dorothy felt a wave of gratitude as she accepted the water. "Thank you, dear," she said softly, unscrewing the cap with fingers that ached from arthritis. As she took a long, satisfying drink, Dorothy noticed a well-dressed man walking back from the front lavatory toward first class. He paused briefly, his gaze taking in the scene. Dorothy with her borrowed water bottle, Heather chatting animatedly with passengers several rows ahead while deliberately avoiding their section. Something in his expression shifted, a flash of recognition that Dorothy understood immediately. He had seen what happened. More importantly, he had recognized what it was. Their eyes met briefly, a moment of silent acknowledgement passing between them before he continued toward the front of the plane. Dr. Athi didn't expect anything to come of it. In her experience, most people noticed injustice but found it easier to look away. She took another sip of water, savoring the relief it brought. The plane continued its journey westward, carrying over 200 souls through the sky, each with their own story, their own destination. Dorothy Williams gazed out at the clouds below, thinking of the great-granddaughter she was about to meet for the first time. Unaware that her own journey was about to take an unexpected turn, the small bottle of water from the kind young mother was gone now, and Dorothy's throat felt dry again. 2 hours had passed since takeoff, and the plane had reached its cruising altitude, sailing through occasional patches of turbulence that made the seatbelt sign flicker on and off like a nervous warning. Dorothy checked her watch, a gift from her late husband, its leather band worn soft with age. 4 more hours to go. She thought about her son Thomas waiting at the San Francisco airport, probably already pacing despite knowing her flight wouldn't land for hours. Thomas had always been the worrier in the family, a trait he'd inherited from his father. Just like your daddy, she would tell him, always watching the clock and expecting the worst. But today Dorothy wished she could call him, just to hear a friendly voice. The borrowed water had helped, but her medication needed consistent hydration, and the dryness was returning with a vengeance. The young mother who had shared her water was now busy with her toddler, who had awakened cranky and confused. Dorothy didn't want to impose further. The couple beside her remained cocooned in their private world of shared earbuds and whispered conversations. Across the aisle, the businessman had fallen asleep, his laptop closed but his water glass mysteriously refilled again. Dorothy noticed that Heather, the flight attendant who had ignored her earlier, seemed to have developed a route through the cabin that somehow always bypassed Dorothy's immediate area. It was a skill Dorothy recognized from her teaching days, the way certain students would create elaborate paths around the desks of classmates they wished to avoid. The call button tempted her again. Her doctor's stern warning echoed in her mind. "Mrs. Williams, these pills will help your joints, but they're diuretics. You must stay hydrated." Dorothy had promised him she would take care of herself. With a small sigh, she reached up and pressed the button again. This time it was nearly 30 minutes before anyone responded. A different flight attendant appeared, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes. "Can I help you?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the mechanical efficiency of someone midway through a long shift. "I'm sorry to trouble you," Dorothy said, her southern politeness ingrained after decades of careful social navigation. "But I need some water. I've taken medication that requires hydration, and I haven't been able to get a drink since boarding." The flight attendant, his name tag read Richard, frowned slightly. "We completed beverage service in this section over an hour ago. Didn't you get anything then?" Dorothy hesitated, not wanting to cause trouble for anyone. "I seem to have been overlooked," she said simply. Richard's frown deepened. "Let me check with my colleague. She was handling this section." He turned and walked toward the galley where Heather was arranging items on a cart. Dorothy couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see Heather's dismissive gesture and the way she shook her head without looking in Dorothy's direction. Richard seemed to hesitate, then nodded and returned to Dorothy. "I'm told the next service will begin shortly," he said, not quite meeting Dorothy's eyes. "Can you wait until then?" Before Dorothy could respond, the young mother across the aisle spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. "She's been waiting for hours. My toddler has had 3 cups of juice since we took off, but this lady hasn't been offered anything." Richard looked uncomfortable, caught between a passenger's obvious need and his colleague's unexplained resistance. "I'll see what I can do," he said finally, and disappeared toward the back of the plane. 10 minutes later, he returned with a small plastic cup of water. "Here you go," he said, handing it to Dorothy. "Sorry about the confusion." Dorothy accepted the cup gratefully. "Thank you kindly." The water was barely enough to swallow her next pill, but she didn't complain. Richard hesitated, then lowered his voice. "If you need anything else, Press the button twice. That way I'll know it's you." With that small act of kindness, he moved on, responding to another call further back in the cabin. Dorothy sipped the water slowly, making it last. The young mother across the aisle gave her a sympathetic smile before returning her attention to her child. Another hour passed. The meal service began, if the small trays of prepackaged food could be called a meal. Dorothy watched as the carts made their way down the aisles, row by row. She noticed that first class was receiving hot meals on actual plates with metal silverware. The smell of warm bread and cooked food drifted back to economy, a tantalizing reminder of the invisible line between classes. When the meal cart reached Dorothy's row, it was Heather pushing it again. She served the couple next to Dorothy efficiently, offering them a choice between chicken and pasta. But when she turned to Dorothy, her smile vanished. "We're out of chicken," she said flatly, dropping a pasta tray on Dorothy's table without asking her preference. Before Dorothy could request a drink, Heather had moved on to the next row. Dorothy looked down at the sealed tray. She wasn't particularly hungry, but the thirst was becoming uncomfortable. The tiny cup Richard had brought was long empty. She unwrapped the plasticware and peeled back the foil on the pasta, hoping the meal might include a beverage. There was no drink, not even the small cups of water that other passengers had received with their meals. Dorothy ate a few bites of the pasta, which was bland and slightly cold, but stopped when the dryness in her mouth made swallowing difficult. She was contemplating pressing the call button twice, as Richard had suggested, when she noticed the well-dressed man from first class walking down the aisle again. This time, he moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the rows until they found Dorothy. He paused by her seat. "Excuse me," he said, his voice carrying a warm tone that reminded Dorothy of her favorite jazz records. "I couldn't help noticing earlier. Are you being looked after properly?" Dorothy was caught off guard by his directness. In her experience, such moments of unfairness were usually witnessed but rarely acknowledged. She found herself unable to maintain her usual mask of dignified acceptance. "Not particularly," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to get some water for my medication, but—" She gestured vaguely at her empty tray. The man's expression darkened momentarily before settling into something more controlled. "That's not acceptable," he said simply. "My name is Gabriel Chen. I'll be right back." Before Dorothy could respond, Gabriel was striding toward the front of the plane with the confidence of someone used to solving problems. Dorothy watched him go, not allowing herself to hope for much. In her 78 years, she had learned that occasionally people made grand gestures of outrage on her behalf, but these rarely translated to meaningful change. From her seat, Dorothy could see Gabriel speaking with the lead flight attendant near the first-class cabin. He wasn't causing a scene. His body language remained calm and controlled, but something in his manner commanded attention. The lead flight attendant, a woman with streaks of gray in her dark hair, listened intently, her expression shifting from professional neutrality to concern. A few minutes later, both Gabriel and the lead flight attendant disappeared into the galley. Dorothy returned her attention to her half-eaten meal, not wanting to appear to be watching. She had just decided to try pressing Richard's suggested double call button when a shadow fell across her tray. "Mrs." It was the lead flight attendant, her name tag reading Patricia. "Williams," Dorothy supplied. "Dorothy Williams." "Mrs. Williams, I want to personally apologize for any oversight in our service today. Mr. Chen has brought it to my attention that you've been having difficulty getting beverages." Dorothy noticed Heather hovering a few rows back, her expression a mixture of defensiveness and annoyance. "It happens," Dorothy said graciously, not wanting to create more trouble. "Busy flight." Patricia's professional smile didn't waver, but her eyes softened with genuine concern. "Nevertheless, it's unacceptable. May I bring you something to drink right away? Water, juice, soda? We also have coffee and tea." "Water would be wonderful," Dorothy said. "And perhaps some cranberry juice if you have it. My doctor recommends it." "Of course. I'll be right back." True to her word, Patricia returned moments Later, with not just water and cranberry juice, but also a warm cloth for Dorothy's hands, a pillow for her back, and a dessert that had only been served in first class, a small dish of vanilla ice cream with caramel sauce. "Mr. Chen thought you might enjoy this," Patricia explained, arranging everything carefully on Dorothy's tray. "Is there anything else you need?" The sudden attention was almost as uncomfortable as the previous neglect, but Dorothy accepted it with grace. "This is more than enough. Thank you." As Patricia moved away, Dorothy noticed Gabriel watching from the threshold between cabins. She raised her water glass slightly in acknowledgement. He nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth before returning to his "Eat in first class." Dorothy sipped her water and juice, feeling the blessed relief as the liquid soothed her parched throat. She took another pill, knowing it would work better now that she was properly hydrated. The ice cream was a luxury she hadn't expected, cold and sweet and somehow tasting of kindness. The young mother across the aisle caught her eye and gave her a thumbs up. Dorothy smiled back, feeling a connection with this stranger who had noticed her struggle and offered help without hesitation. The plane continued westward, chasing the sun as it descended toward the horizon. 3 more hours until they reached San Francisco. 3 more hours until she would meet her great-granddaughter for the first time. Dorothy settled back in her seat, feeling the tension in her body ease slightly. The simple act of being seen, really seen, by Gabriel Chen had changed something in the air around her. It wasn't just about the water or the ice cream or even the apology. It was about dignity. About reminding everyone on this metal tube hurling through the sky that every passenger deserved basic human respect, regardless of the class printed on their boarding pass or the color of their skin. As Dorothy finished her ice cream, she wondered what would happen next. Gabriel Chen didn't strike her as a man who made halfway gestures. Something told her that this small intervention was just the beginning. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted subtly after Gabriel's intervention. Dorothy noticed Patricia, the lead flight attendant, making more frequent passes through their section, her gaze occasionally sweeping over to check on Dorothy with a professional smile. Heather had made herself scarce, now working primarily in the forward cabins, though Dorothy caught her throwing glances backward from time to time, her expression unreadable. The young mother across the aisle had introduced herself as Lucia during a quiet moment when her toddler was sleeping again. "I'm glad someone said something," she had whispered to Dorothy. "I was about to make a fuss myself." Dorothy had smiled at that. "Young folks are braver these days," she'd replied. "In my time, we just endured." Now, as the plane began its gradual descent from cruising altitude, Dorothy found herself wondering about Gabriel Chen. What had compelled him to step in? Most people noticed unfairness but stayed in their comfortable bubbles, especially those lucky enough to be in first class. There was something about him that reminded her of her late husband, a quiet dignity and unwillingness to look away from injustice, no matter how small. Dorothy was lost in these thoughts when she felt someone slide into the empty middle seat beside her. The young couple had moved several rows back to sit with friends, leaving the 2 seats vacant. She turned, surprised to find Gabriel settling in next to her. "Hope you don't mind," he said, his voice low and pleasant. "Thought we could chat for a bit before landing. Those first-class seats get lonely." Dorothy couldn't help but smile at this obvious excuse. First class was many things, but rarely lonely. "It's a free country, or so they say," she replied with a hint of humor. "Though I suspect sitting in economy might be against some airline rule for fancy folks like yourself." Gabriel laughed, a genuine sound that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Technically, I'm just stretching my legs before landing. But between us, I wanted to check how you're doing. I'm fine thanks to your intervention, though I suspect you've made an enemy of that flight attendant." "Heather?" Gabriel shrugged. "Some people need a reminder about basic human decency." "Did Patricia explain why you were being overlooked?" Dorothy adjusted her reading glasses, which had slipped down her nose. "No explanations offered and none expected. I've lived 7 decades as a black woman in America, Mr. Chen. This isn't my first rodeo." Gabriel nodded, his expression thoughtful. My grandmother came to California from Hong Kong in the 1950s. She had similar stories, being ignored in stores, taxis driving past her, restaurants suddenly having no tables available. She taught me to recognize the patterns. Dorothy studied him with new interest. His tailored suit and confident demeanor screamed success, but there was something in his eyes that spoke of understanding what it meant to be considered other. Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman, Dorothy said. She was. She also taught me that witnessing injustice and doing nothing makes you complicit. Gabriel glanced toward the front of the plane. When I saw what was happening, I thought about what she would expect of me. Well, I appreciate it, though I hope you didn't make too much of a fuss. I'm not one for scenes. Gabriel smiled. No, scenes. Just a frank conversation about professional standards and company policy, and perhaps a mention that my firm handles quite a bit of corporate litigation. Dorothy chuckled. Ah, so you're a lawyer. That explains the fancy suit and the way you choose your words. Guilty as charged, Gabriel admitted. Though these days I mostly handle corporate mergers. Less exciting, but it pays for the first-class tickets. He paused, then asked, What takes you to San Francisco, Mrs. Williams? Dorothy, please. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, swiping to a photo of a newborn wrapped in a yellow blanket. My great-granddaughter, Lily. Born 3 weeks ago, this will be my first time meeting her. Gabriel's face softened as he looked at the photo. She's beautiful. Your first great-grandchild? Second. My grandson, David, has a little boy who's 3. Now, lives in Atlanta, so I see him more often. Dorothy swiped to another photo, this one of a smiling toddler with Dorothy's same warm brown eyes. That's James, smartest little boy you ever met. Already knows all his letters. Clearly takes after his great-grandmother, Gabriel said with a smile. You have children, Mr. Chen? Gabriel, please. And no, not yet. My wife and I have been focused on careers. She's a surgeon at UCSF Medical Center. He pulled out his own phone, showing Dorothy a photo of a stunning woman in surgical scrubs. That's Alice. We're thinking about starting a family soon, though. I'm not getting any younger. Dorothy laughed. You're what, 40? Plenty of time. 43, Gabriel corrected with a grin. But in lawyer years, that's ancient. Their conversation flowed easily after that. Gabriel telling Dorothy about growing up in Oakland with parents who expected nothing less than excellence. Dorothy sharing stories of her teaching days and the generations of children who still stopped her on the street to thank her for believing in them. Halfway through their conversation, Dorothy noticed Heather watching them from the galley, her face a mask of professional neutrality that didn't quite hide her discomfort at seeing a first-class passenger chatting so amicably with the very woman she had been ignoring. I think we have an audience, Dorothy murmured, nodding slightly in Heather's direction. Gabriel didn't turn around. Good. Maybe she's learning something. What did you say to them exactly, when you spoke to Patricia? Gabriel considered for a moment. I simply pointed out that I had noticed a pattern of service discrepancy that seemed to specifically affect you. I mentioned that as someone who travels frequently for business, I value airlines that treat all passengers with equal respect. And that worked? I may have also mentioned that my firm represents several major corporations in the travel industry, and that discriminatory service practices, even subtle ones, can become expensive PR nightmares in today's social media environment. He smiled slightly. But mostly, I think Patricia is just a decent person who was horrified when she realized what was happening. She promised to address it with her team. Dorothy nodded thoughtfully. Most people aren't malicious, they just don't notice, or they notice but convince themselves it's not their problem. Exactly. Sometimes they need a little nudge to do the right thing. Gabriel checked his watch. We should be landing in about 40 minutes. As if on cue, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their initial descent into San Francisco International Airport and instructing flight attendants to prepare the cabin for arrival. Patricia appeared at their row moments later, her professional smile firmly in place. Mr. Chen, I'm afraid I need to ask you to return to your seat in first class for landing. Of course, Gabriel said, standing smoothly. Just catching up with my friend Dorothy here. Patricia turned to Dorothy. Is there anything else you need? Before we land, Mrs. Williams? No, thank you. You've been very kind. As Patricia moved away, Gabriel lingered for a moment. Dorothy, if you don't mind, I'd like to introduce you to someone before we land. May I come back once we're on the ground? Curious, Dorothy nodded. Of course. Gabriel returned to first class, leaving Dorothy to wonder what he was planning. She watched out the window as the plane descended through clouds, revealing the sparkling blue of San Francisco Bay and the iconic Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. Somewhere down there, her son Thomas was waiting, probably pacing anxiously and checking flight trackers on his phone. As the plane made its final approach, Dorothy thought about how this journey had taken an unexpected turn. What had started as a familiar experience of being overlooked had become something different, a reminder that sometimes allies appeared in unexpected places. The landing was smooth, the massive wheels touching down with barely a bump before the engine's reverse thrust, pushing passengers gently against their seatbelts as the plane decelerated. As they taxied toward the gate, the cabin filled with the sounds of seatbelts unclicking and overhead bins being opened by impatient travelers. Despite the illuminated signs requesting everyone remain seated, Dorothy stayed put, knowing from experience that rushing only led to standing awkwardly in the aisle. As the plane reached its gate and the seatbelt sign finally turned off, the cabin erupted into motion, people standing, pulling down bags, checking phones that had been in airplane mode. True to his word, Gabriel appeared again as the first-class passengers were disembarking. But he wasn't alone. With him was an older Asian woman, perhaps in her 60s, dressed in an airline uniform with captain's stripes on the shoulders. Dorothy, I'd like you to meet Captain Linda Wong. She's the pilot who just flew us safely to San Francisco. Dorothy's eyebrows rose in surprise as she shook the captain's hand. It's a pleasure to meet you, Captain. That was one of the smoothest landings I've ever experienced. Captain Wong smiled warmly. Thank you, Mrs. Williams, that's high praise. Gabriel and I go way back. Our mothers were college roommates. When he messaged me about what happened during the flight, I wanted to personally apologize on behalf of the airline. Oh, that's not necessary, Dorothy began, but Captain Wong held up a hand. It absolutely is. What you experienced is not what we stand for. I've already spoken with Patricia, and there will be a formal review of in-flight service procedures. She reached into her pocket and handed Dorothy a card. This is my direct contact information. If you ever fly with us again and experience anything less than excellent service, please let me know immediately. Dorothy was momentarily speechless, unused to having her concerns taken so seriously. Thank you, she managed finally. That's very kind. It's not kindness, Captain Wong corrected gently. It's professionalism and basic respect, things we seem to need reminders about sometimes. She checked her watch. I have to go complete my post-flight checks, but it was an honor to meet you, Mrs. Williams. Enjoy your time with your new great-granddaughter. As Captain Wong walked away, Dorothy turned to Gabriel with an expression of amazement. You contacted the pilot during the flight? Gabriel smiled. Modern planes have messaging systems. Linda and I have known each other since we were kids. When I saw what was happening, I sent her a quick message. Some lessons need to come from the top. Dorothy shook her head, impressed and touched by his thoroughness. You don't do anything halfway, do you, Mr. Chen? Gabriel, he corrected with a smile. And no, my grandmother wouldn't approve of halfway measures when it comes to doing what's right. As the last passengers filed past them toward the exit, Dorothy noticed Heather standing near the front, watching their interaction with an unreadable expression. The lesson being taught was clear to everyone observing. Dignity was not determined by the class of service on your boarding pass or the color of your skin, but by the basic respect every human being deserved. As the plane emptied, Dorothy remained seated, allowing the rush of impatient passengers to thin out before attempting to stand. Her joints were stiff from the 6-hour flight, and she knew better than to rush. Gabriel stood in the aisle beside her row, effectively blocking anyone from pushing past, creating a small pocket of calm amid the deplaning chaos. No hurry, he assured her, noticing her slight wince as she gathered her belongings. The airport isn't going anywhere. Dorothy appreciated his understanding. So many young people seem to view the elderly as obstacles rather than people who simply moved at a different pace. My son will be waiting, she said, but he knows his mother doesn't sprint these days. Once the main crowd had cleared, Gabriel offered his arm. Dorothy hesitated only briefly before accepting it, allowing him to steady her as she rose from the seat that had been her home for the past 6 hours. Her legs protested after the long period of inactivity, but she straightened herself with dignity, smoothing her navy dress with her free hand. As they made their way slowly up the aisle, Dorothy noticed Heather standing near the exit, her professional smile firmly in place as she bid farewell to departing passengers. When Heather saw Dorothy approaching with Gabriel, her smile faltered momentarily before she reinforced it, though it now seemed more like a grimace. "Thank you for flying with us today," Heather said mechanically as they reached the door. Before Dorothy could respond with the graciousness she had practiced for 78 years, Gabriel paused. "Actually, I wanted to thank you, Heather," he said, his voice pleasant but carrying an undercurrent that made the flight attendant's eyes widen slightly. "Sir? You provided an excellent teaching moment today," Gabriel continued, his tone conversational, but his eyes intent. "Sometimes we don't realize our biases until they're pointed out to us. I hope the lesson sticks." Heather's professional mask slipped for just a moment, showing a flash of defensive anger before she regained control. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir. I treat all passengers equally." Dorothy, sensing the flight attendant's discomfort, patted Gabriel's arm. "We should go, dear. My son is waiting." Gabriel nodded but added softly to Heather, "Equal treatment isn't about intention, it's about impact. Something to consider for your next flight." With that, he guided Dorothy into the jet bridge, leaving the flight attendant standing stiffly in the doorway. "Was that necessary?" Dorothy asked as they walked slowly toward the terminal. "Probably not," Gabriel admitted with a small smile, "but my grandmother always said that uncomfortable moments are where growth happens. Maybe it'll make her think twice next time." Dorothy shook her head, but there was a hint of amusement in her eyes. Young people always think they can change the world one conversation at a time. "Isn't that what you did as a teacher?" Gabriel asked. "Change the world one student at a time?" The question caught Dorothy off guard. It was true. She had spent 43 years believing that each interaction with a child mattered, that small moments of kindness or correction could shape a life. Perhaps she and Gabriel weren't so different after all, just operating in different classrooms. "Touché, counselor," she conceded with a smile. "You'd have made a good trial lawyer." As they emerged into the bustling terminal, the usual cacophony of announcements, rolling suitcases, and hurried conversations enveloped them. Gabriel slowed his pace to match Dorothy's careful steps, seemingly unbothered by the crowd streaming past them. "Do you need to go straight to baggage claim?" he asked. "Or would you like to sit for a moment first?" "A moment's rest would be welcome," Dorothy admitted. Her medication had helped with the joint pain, but the long walk through the terminal looked daunting after the flight. Gabriel guided her to a quiet seating area near their gate, relatively empty now that their flight had deplaned. As Dorothy settled onto a comfortable chair, Gabriel excused himself briefly, returning minutes later with 2 bottles of water and a small paper bag. "I thought you might need to take another pill," he explained, handing her one of the waters. "And these are from the bakery near the gate. My wife says they make the best chocolate chip cookies in the airport." Dorothy accepted the offerings with a grateful smile. "You think of everything, don't you?" "I try," Gabriel said, sitting beside her. "Professional habit. In my line of work, overlooking details can cost millions." As Dorothy sipped her water and enjoyed a cookie that was indeed excellent, she studied her unexpected guardian angel. There was a gentleness to him that seemed at odds with his powerful presence, a combination that reminded her of the best male teachers she had worked with over the decades, men who understood that true strength came from kindness, not dominance. "Tell me more about your grandmother," Dorothy said, "the one who taught you to recognize injustice." Gabriel's expression softened. Her name was Mei Chen. She came to San Francisco in 1956 with almost nothing, just a small suitcase and determination. She worked as a seamstress in Chinatown, saving every penny. Eventually opened her own small alteration shop. He pulled out his phone and showed Dorothy a photo of an elderly Asian woman with bright, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense expression. This was her at my law school graduation. She lived to see me become a partner at my firm. Passed away 3 years ago. She looks like a woman who didn't suffer fools gladly, Dorothy observed. Gabriel laughed. That's putting it mildly. She had a saying in Cantonese that roughly translates to, politeness is good, but justice is better. He paused, his expression growing more serious. When I was about 10, we were at a department store, and she was being ignored by the sales staff. After several minutes, she simply sat down on a display chair and announced she would wait until someone remembered their manners. She sat there for 45 minutes until the manager finally approached her. Did they help her then? Dorothy asked. They tried to remove her, Gabriel said with a smile. But Mei Chen was not easily moved when she believed she was right. She simply asked very loudly why the white customers were getting help immediately while she had been waiting for nearly an hour. The entire store got quiet. She got her customer service after that and an apology from the manager. Dorothy laughed softly, picturing the scene. I would have liked your grandmother. She would have liked you too, Gabriel said warmly. She always said you could tell a person's character by how they handle being treated unfairly. Do they lose their dignity? Or do they stand firm in who they are? You reminded me of her today. Before Dorothy could respond, their moment of connection was interrupted by an announcement overhead, calling a passenger to return to their gate. The spell broke and Dorothy realized they had been sitting for nearly 20 minutes. I should find my son, she said, gathering her purse. He'll be worrying himself sick by now. Of course, Gabriel said, standing to help her up. Let me walk you to baggage claim. As they made their way through the terminal, Dorothy noticed several flight crew members from their plane walking ahead of them, including Patricia and Captain Wong, deep in conversation. From their serious expressions and occasional glances, back at Heather, who trailed several paces behind them, it appeared the situation was being addressed. Looks like your friend the captain is having a word with the team, Dorothy observed quietly. Gabriel followed her gaze and nodded. Linda doesn't tolerate discrimination on her flights. I suspect there will be a formal review. I almost feel bad for Heather, Dorothy admitted. She's young. We all make mistakes when we're young. True, Gabriel agreed. But consequences help us learn from those mistakes. My grandmother would say growth rarely happens in comfort zones. They reached the escalator leading down to baggage claim, and Dorothy gripped the handrail carefully as they descended. The open area below was crowded with waiting families and travelers clustered around carousels. Dorothy scanned the crowd looking for her son. Thomas will be by that pillar, she said confidently. Always stands in the same spot, ever since he was a boy. Says it makes him easier to find. Sure enough, a tall man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and Dorothy's same warm brown eyes was standing exactly where she had predicted, checking his watch with a worried expression. When he spotted his mother on the escalator, his face lit up with relief. There's my son, Dorothy said proudly. She turned to Gabriel, suddenly realizing their time together was coming to an end. For a moment, she felt an unexpected sadness. Their connection, though brief, had been meaningful. I suppose this is where we part ways. It doesn't have to be, Gabriel said, pulling a business card from his wallet and pressing it into her hand. I'd like to introduce you to Alice someday. Maybe you could join us for dinner while you're in town? Meet my wife, tell her about your great-granddaughter. Dorothy was touched by the gesture. I'd like that, she said, tucking the card carefully into her purse. As they reached the bottom of the escalator, Thomas rushed forward, enveloping his mother in a gentle but enthusiastic hug. Mom, I was getting worried, he said, stepping back to examine her. Flight landed almost an hour ago. Everything okay? Everything's fine, Thomas, Dorothy assured him. Just made a new friend who slowed me down a bit. She turned to introduce Gabriel, but found he had already extended his hand to her son. "Gabriel Chen," he said. "Your mother is an extraordinary woman. She taught me a thing or two about dignity today." Thomas shook his hand, looking slightly confused but pleased. "That sounds like my mom. Been teaching folks her whole life." As the three of them walked toward the baggage carousel, Dorothy noticed Heather and the other flight crew members entering the baggage claim area. Captain Wong was still speaking intently to Heather, whose expression had shifted from defensive to something more reflective, perhaps even contrite. When Heather spotted Dorothy with her son and Gabriel, she hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Breaking away from the group, she approached them directly, her steps determined but her expression uncertain. "Mrs. Williams," she began, her voice quieter than it had been on the plane. "I owe you an apology for the service on today's flight. It was unacceptable, and I'm truly sorry." Dorothy studied the young woman's face, seeing beyond the practiced smile to the genuine discomfort beneath. There was a lesson happening here, one that went beyond airline service protocols to something more fundamental about how humans treat one another. "We all have our blind spots, dear," Dorothy said gently. "The important thing is what we do when they're pointed out to us." Heather nodded, seeming to absorb the words. "Thank you for your understanding. I promise it won't happen again, to you or anyone else." As Heather rejoined her colleagues, Thomas raised his eyebrows at his mother. "What exactly happened on that flight, Mom?" Dorothy patted her son's arm reassuringly. "I'll tell you on the drive to meet little Lily. It's a story about water, dignity, and a lawyer with a very wise grandmother." 3 days into her visit, Dorothy sat in a rocking chair by the window of her son's San Francisco apartment, cradling her newborn great-granddaughter against her chest. Baby Lily was asleep, her tiny fingers curled around Dorothy's thumb with surprising strength. Outside, fog rolled in from the bay, wrapping the city in a soft gray blanket that reminded Dorothy of early mornings back in South Carolina. Thomas entered quietly, carrying 2 mugs of tea. "She finally asleep?" he whispered, setting one mug on the side table within Dorothy's reach. Dorothy nodded, not taking her eyes off the peaceful face nestled against her. Just nodded off. "Lord, she's perfect, isn't she?" Thomas smiled, the proud father and grandfather. "Takes after her great-grandmother." Dorothy chuckled softly. "Flattery will get you everywhere." She sipped her tea, careful not to disturb the sleeping infant. "Have you heard back from that airline yet?" After hearing the full story of what happened on the flight, Thomas had been furious. Only Dorothy's insistence had prevented him from marching back to the airport to file a formal complaint. Instead, he'd written a detailed letter to the airline's customer service department, copying Captain Wong on the email as Dorothy had suggested. "Got a call this morning while you were in the shower," Thomas said, settling into the chair opposite her. "From someone in their executive office, if you can believe it. They're taking it very seriously." "I'm not surprised," Dorothy said. "Not after Gabriel and the captain got involved." "Speaking of your night in a business suit," Thomas said with a smile. "He called while you were napping. Wanted to know if you're still up for dinner tomorrow night." Dorothy felt a small flutter of anticipation. She'd enjoyed her brief connection with Gabriel and was looking forward to meeting his wife. "Did you tell him yes?" "I did. They're picking you up at 6. Thomas studied his mother's face. "You've made quite an impression on this lawyer fellow." "We connected," Dorothy said simply. "Sometimes the good Lord puts people in your path for a reason." The next evening found Dorothy dressed in her best outfit, a deep purple dress with a matching jacket that she saved for special occasions. Thomas helped her with her pearl earrings, the ones his father had given her on their 30th anniversary. "You look beautiful, Mom," he said, stepping back to admire her. "For an old lady, you mean?" Dorothy teased, checking her reflection in the mirror. "No," Thomas said seriously. "Just beautiful, period." When the doorbell rang at precisely 6 o'clock, Thomas answered to find Gabriel and a striking woman with short black hair and an elegant burgundy dress standing in the hallway, a bouquet of white lilies in her hands. "Mrs. Williams," Gabriel said warmly as Dorothy approached. "May I introduce my wife, Dr. Alice Chen?" Alice stepped forward with a warm smile, offering the flowers. "It's wonderful to meet you, Mrs. Williams. Gabriel has talked about nothing else since the flight." "Please call me Dorothy," she replied, accepting the lilies. "These are lovely. And I hope he hasn't bored you with tales of an old woman's troubles." "Quite the contrary," Alice said. "I've been inspired by your dignity in the face of poor treatment. Unfortunately, it's something I've experienced too many times myself. Even wearing a doctor's coat, the restaurant Gabriel had chosen was upscale but comfortable, with private booths that allowed for easy conversation without straining to hear over the ambient noise. After they were seated and had ordered, Alice leaned forward with genuine interest. "Gabriel tells me you were a teacher for over 40 years, she said. "What grades did you teach?" "Third grade mostly," Dorothy replied.
That's when children are still excited about learning but old enough to tackle real challenges. The perfect age, if you ask me. As the evening progressed, Dorothy found herself sharing stories she hadn't thought about in years. The struggling
student who later became a professor, the classroom pet snake that escaped for 3 days, the time she organized a student protest against the district's plan to cut music programs. "You were quite the activist," Gabriel observed with admiration. "In my own quiet way," Dorothy said. "I've always believed there's power in standing your ground without raising your voice. My mother taught me that. Like when you press that call button twice more after being ignored," Alice noted. "Exactly," Dorothy nodded. "Persistence without aggression. Works in most situations, though not all." She paused, then added, "But sometimes you need someone like your husband to step in and speak the language of power." Gabriel looked slightly uncomfortable with the praise. "I just did what anyone should do." "But that's just it," Dorothy said, her voice gentle but firm. "Most people don't. They notice, they might feel bad about it, but they don't act. That's why what you did matters." As they were finishing dessert, a chocolate souffle that Dorothy declared was sinfully good, Gabriel seemed to be contemplating something. Finally, he spoke. "Dorothy, there's something I'd like to ask you," he began. "The incident on the plane has been on my mind, and not just because of what happened to you specifically." Dorothy set down her spoon, giving him her full attention. "Go on." "I've been thinking about how many people must experience what you did every day, the small indignities, the being overlooked or ignored, especially older people and people of color." He hesitated, then continued. "My firm does a lot of pro bono work, but it's mostly focused on housing rights and immigration. I'm thinking of starting a new initiative focused on age and race discrimination in public accommodations and services." Alice reached over and squeezed her husband's hand, clearly hearing this idea for the first time herself. "That sounds wonderful, Gabriel." Gabriel nodded, then looked directly at Dorothy. "What I'm asking is whether you'd consider being a consultant for this initiative. Your perspective as both an educator and someone who has navigated these waters for decades would be invaluable." Dorothy was speechless for a moment, genuinely surprised by the offer. "I'm flattered, but I'm not sure what I could contribute. I don't know anything about the law." "You know about life," Gabriel said simply. "And sometimes that's what lawyers need most, a reminder of the human realities behind the legal principles." Dorothy thought about it, imagining the possibilities. At 78, she had assumed her teaching days were behind her, but perhaps there was one more classroom waiting for her. "I'd be honored," she said finally, "though I'll need to divide my time between here and South Carolina. My home and church community are still there." "We'll make it work," Gabriel assured her. "We can arrange video calls when you're not in town, and the airline owes you some free flights, I'd say." Dorothy laughed at that. "At the very least." As the evening drew to a close, they stood outside the restaurant waiting for the car Gabriel had arranged. The fog had lifted, revealing a clear night sky with stars visible despite the city lights. "I got a call from Captain Wong this afternoon," Gabriel mentioned casually. "She wanted me to tell you that Heather has been required to take additional training, but she's also requested it herself. Apparently your words made quite an impact." Dorothy nodded, unsurprised. Sometimes people just need to see themselves clearly for a moment. It's uncomfortable but necessary for growth. "Like my grandmother sitting in that department store," Gabriel said with a smile. Exactly like that. Dorothy paused, then added, "You know, in all my years of teaching, I found that the most powerful lessons aren't planned. They happen in those unexpected moments when someone chooses to do the right thing, even when it's uncomfortable." The car arrived, and as Gabriel helped Dorothy into the back seat, Alice slipped in beside her. "Gabriel told me about your great-granddaughter," Alice said. "Do you have pictures?" As Dorothy proudly displayed photos of baby Lily on her phone, she reflected on the strange turns life could take. A painful experience on a flight had led to this unexpected friendship and perhaps a new purpose in her later years. 2 weeks later, Dorothy was back home in South Carolina, sitting on her porch swing with a glass of sweet tea. Her neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, had come over to hear all about the new baby and the trip to San Francisco. "Sounds like you had quite the adventure," Mrs. Johnson said, after Dorothy had recounted the story of the flight and her dinner with the Chens. "That lawyer fellow certainly went above and beyond." "He did," Dorothy agreed. "But you know what struck me most? How one person's choice to not look away can change everything, not just for me on that flight, but perhaps for others down the line." Her phone chimed with a message notification. It was from Gabriel, sending a photo of letterhead for the Dignity Initiative with Dorothy's name listed as founding consultant. "What's that smile about?" Mrs. Johnson asked. "Just thinking about how the good Lord works," Dorothy replied, showing her the message. "Sometimes the water you've been asking for comes in ways you never expected." As the evening sun cast long shadows across her garden, Dorothy thought about all the lessons she had taught in her lifetime and all those she had learned. She thought about Mei Chen sitting firmly in that department store chair, refusing to be invisible. She thought about Gabriel, using his privilege to amplify others' voices rather than simply enjoying his first-class comfort. She thought about Heather, hopefully carrying a new awareness into her future interactions. And she thought about how change happens, not always in grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but often in those quiet moments when someone simply says, "I see you. You matter. This is not right." Tomorrow she would call her church group and tell them about the Dignity Initiative. Some of them might have stories to share, experiences that deserved to be heard. There was still work to be done, still lessons to teach, and Dorothy Williams rocked gently in her porch swing, watching the fireflies begin their evening dance in her garden. At 78, she wasn't finished yet. Not by a long shot.